Good morning and welcome back to TVP World. My name is Alex Umland, and these are World Talks, where every word matters. The United States has announced a $500 million aid package for Ukraine, which includes ammunition, missiles, drones, and chemical protective equipment. In a statement published on Thursday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the package is part of a larger effort to bolster Ukraine's military capabilities. The package will be used, he said, to, quote, defend Ukraine against Russia's ongoing attacks. And now joining us to discuss this further is Andreas Umland, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again.
So now $500 million in an aid package to Ukraine, which, like I said, includes ammunition, missiles, drones, and chemical protective equipment. An impressive number, but do you think, is it enough for Ukraine to change the course of the war and stop Russia from advancing in the east? As we've learned this morning, that Russia is in fact advancing towards Pokrovsk there in the east.
It's certainly a good sign and a good decision, and it's the right thing that Ukraine needs now and has been needing basically already for almost 3 years now, and hopefully it will be delivered soon. There is a lot of complaint. I'm speaking here from Kiev that actually some of the aid packages and some of the amounts that have been voiced by both US and European leaders have not actually been materialized. They have not, this aid has actually not yet or been delivered, or some of the promises have actually been taken back. And so there is also a certain show here with all of these announcements. And the question is rather what will eventually really arrive and how quickly it will arrive, and whether it then can be then actually used on the front line.
So you said now that this is a good sign. Of course, hopefully that package does materialize, which brings me to my next question, because recently Time magazine has published an interview with President-elect Donald Trump that quoted him saying that he really opposes Ukraine using U.S.-supplied missiles inside Russian territory. What do you think about that? And if we were to go back to the package for a second, do you think that we will still see such aid from the U.S. after January 20th?
That's a good question, and would have to be perhaps asked rather somebody in Washington than me here in Kiev. Which is, I suppose, however, even from Washington, difficult to say, because there are different advisors around Trump with very different views of this war, and also different interpretations of the nature of this entire conflict, of the origins of this war. And we will see which of these advisors and experts will then have the crucial influence on him, and how Trump will decide himself. If indeed there will be then a limitation of the already given permission to Ukraine to use US weapons on Russian state territory, that would be, I think, actually escalatory, because it would then help Russia to attack Ukraine even more. If it can do so safely from Russian state territory. Lots of the drones, for instance, that are coming from Russia to Ukraine, they're not coming via occupied territories, but just simply over the border from the current valid border between Russia and Ukraine, and not over the front line. So this permission to strike Russia on its own territory is actually quite an important thing. And if that is being limited and will not be extended, that would be very problematic for Ukraine.
And if of course, that were to happen, what kind of signal would it send to Russia, as we, of course, see it acting in countries like Georgia nowadays, but also Romania? What kind of signal would it send, as we can see that it is trying, in fact, to draw these other countries closer to itself and have them rather pull away from the U.S.?
Yes, it will be I think, an encouragement, as I said, for Russia. It would be frustrating for Ukraine and also for other East Central European countries because it would signal to Russia and to everybody else that the US's engagement is limited, that that Washington does not want to take any risks, that the salience of this conflict is not high enough to give such permissions and to help Ukraine to the extent it is necessary. It would also be a rather strange support of Russia's very frightening use of nuclear threats against the West. This limitation of the permission to use conventional weaponry by Ukraine on Russian territory is obviously related to Russia's nuclear threats. And that would be a very grave signal, in fact, to the entire world, because it would mean that, well, if you have nuclear weapons, you can actually get the US to back down. And if you don't have nuclear weapons like Ukraine, you will be left alone by the US. And that will then signal to countries around the world that you may better get weapons of mass destruction instead of relying on international law, international organizations, or international solidarity.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about, you said you're in Kyiv, and I'd like to ask, because let's go back now for a second to President-elect Donald Trump, who has suggested in the past that he will pull U.S. out of NATO. Is this a concern for people in Ukraine, in Kyiv? What are they, thinking? What are they saying about that?
Well, NATO is, of course, a major issue here. Ukraine wants to become a member as soon as possible of NATO, and is, of course, most of all interested in the question whether finally an invitation will be given to Ukraine. This is also seen here in Kyiv as something that perhaps cannot be then realized quickly with an actual entry of Ukraine into NATO, but even the invitation would be an important signal both for Ukrainians and also for Russians that Ukraine is on the path to NATO, and that this is where Ukraine's future lies, and there's nothing that Russia can do about that. Whether then the US will be a full part of NATO, I cannot really imagine that the US simply goes fully away from the alliance, is another issue, of course, also of concern here for Ukraine. It does not change, however, much about the desire of Ukraine to become a member of NATO. It would be odd, indeed, if the US, which, after all, established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949 in Washington, would be now withdrawing either formally or informally from this treaty. But unfortunately, one cannot exclude that.
Now, what about, I'd like us to stay on the subject of Ukraine joining NATO, because in recent public announcement, the Ukrainian president has also said that peace talks could take place with Russia still holding onto territory it has seized in the invasion, but that Ukraine needed an invitation issued to the entire country to join NATO. And I mean, I suppose the million-dollar question everyone is wondering, when and under what conditions will we see this invitation be extended to Ukraine?
Yes, in fact, Ukraine wanted to have this invitation already in 2022 and 23 and 24, and the next NATO summit would be then perhaps the major event on at what one would then look. Whether this will materialize is an open question, because all of the member countries, the 32 member countries, would have to agree to such an invitation. And even if the invitation is then provided, I think the actual accession will take time, as we have seen with the example of Sweden's accession to NATO, and I would assume that Ukraine's full accession to NATO would actually take much longer than the 2 years that it took Sweden to get into NATO. And then the question will be what to do in the meantime. And here, I think the more practical question now to talk about is whether there could be a coalition of the willing, let's say, of European countries that are willing to provide Ukraine with security guarantees that would be sort of equivalent to NATO's Article 5, to the Washington Treaty's Article 5, and then to bridge, so to say, this period between the invitation and the full accession of Ukraine.
And how likely, in your opinion, is such a coalition of the willing, to happen?
I think two factors here are crucial. Which governments would be willing to go for such security guarantees and to join such a coalition? Perhaps there would have to be a new sort of temporary treaty between this coalition and Ukraine. And the second factor is whether the US, and here we come back to President Donald Trump, would be willing either to join this coalition itself, or at least to provide those European countries that are entering such a coalition, providing security guarantees for Ukraine with a sort of a backup, so that to sort of strengthen and renew and make explicit that those countries that are entering such a coalition of a willing are themselves protected fully by NATO and in particular by the US, and can count on the US in case that they will be attacked by Russia.
And which countries, in your opinion, would we see in this kind of coalition?
Well, that's a question, so to say, to ask in every of these capitals. I think the usual suspects here are some of the Central East European countries, including Poland, the Scandinavian countries, Great Britain, the Netherlands have recently become much more hawkish on Russia. But of course, also countries like Germany and France would then be asked whether they would be willing to enter such a coalition of the willing for an intermediate period to cover this sort of interregnum. This would then be something very good, actually, for Ukraine, as long as it cannot become a full member of NATO.
All right. Andreas Umland, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, thank you very much for your insight and for speaking to us here on TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
And with that, it's a wrap for this edition of World Talks. But as always, do stay tuned to TVP World for more breaking news, updates, and interviews like this one.